Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
Welcome back, Meta friends. We've been discussing tariffs, the impact and how to deal with it so our customers and companies thrive. So far, Dennis Schneider and Ron Crabtree discussed the importance of strategic planning as it impacts decisions. And then Bez gave a deep dive into an organization readiness for tariff-driven relocation or diversification. And today we're going to delve into the topic of classifying imports and exports. Many of our listeners know they have to do it, but we want to explore what's really involved, the common mistakes to avoid, and the potential risks, including unexpected costs or lost profits when it's done incorrectly. I'm excited to have Bob Forshay, one of our longtime Meta experts, with us today. And Bob, can you kick us off by telling our audience a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about getting classifications right the first time?
Well, classifications is certainly something that has come up in the recent news, and I think everybody has had to deal with this at some level. Having been a supply chain guy now going back to the 80s, I remember early on, I didn't really have to worry too much about this, and I was, handling the manufacturing and sourcing side, but I didn't really have to worry about the transportation and import-export. We actually had full-time staff on the team who would handle a lot of that for us. So we didn't have to know all the details. The nice thing about that is there are a lot of details, and it's really a full-time job if you do any amount of import-export at all. So in the recent time, in the last year, this has started to come up a lot more. And doing some work with a client I had here last year, it turned out to be a major consideration that they hadn't really prepared for. Things kind of happened by default. No one in the organization really understood it. The person who had been plugged into their rating system was no longer with the company, and no one else knew what was happening or what should be happening. So I really had to dig in and get up to speed quickly. It was quite an education there.
Okay. So if you're a company that's just getting started or you're reassessing like your situation, where should they begin and who should be involved in the research? What kind of resources or steps would you recommend?
So there's going to be two things to look at. One is if it's a new situation, if it's a new product or a new organization, then you have a little bit more research to do where it has to be essentially matched up with one of the different many possible classifications that you can see. The place to start is to talk to other companies who do something already like what you do. There's going to be some knowledge there according to what has the best, most favorable rates and what's the easiest to support. And there can be a lot of different interpretations of these ratings, which is why you want to be very, very careful. When you first get your established classification, it's pretty much on the honor system, and then you have to make sure that you're going to be comfortable working within that classification over time. So if things change, if technology changes, if materials change, then your classification very well could have to change along with it. That's not a really big problem. But if you happen to get it wrong because you make an assumption or don't get expertise, that can be a big problem. Resolving that one could go a couple of different ways. One thing that could happen is you make a change and something shows up in customs and they say, look, here's this firm who's been doing things for 5 years. Suddenly the same product is showing up as a different number. We need to ask more questions. And that usually is not, going to have a positive outcome. Another situation that can happen is that it needs to be reclassified because of some other factor, a change in the tariff code, for example, like we've seen, because there's things that go back to 2005, then there's new classifications in 2018, 2017, 2018, and then there's 3 different layers of classification groupings in terms of what's happening with product or product definition. The other thing that can happen is that maybe it's not a new company, new product, but there may be some changes to the tariff which cause the rate to be highly unfavorable. And so we want to look at what could you do instead. The challenge here is if you change the classification to get a more favorable rate, that can stir up some questions as well. Once questions
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now-
What would you do?
once questions surface like that, it pretty much becomes the domain of the customs. And when they do the research, you are required to abide by their final decision. There is no appeal process. So if you if are found to have an unfavorable finding, then you may end up with a worse situation than when you started. If
Well, that's
you,
pretty scary.
yeah, there's not a lot of recourse there. Their decision becomes final. So if they make a change and it's not in your favor, it's like, oh well, too bad now.
Wow.
A better approach is to proactively go in and look for, this is a research project, you have to look for other case history where there might have been a finding or a requested evaluation. So you can request evaluation, and that can give you feedback to help you kind of slot, am I in here or am I here or am I here? That can give you a lot of guidance based on your engineering support, your materials definition. There's a few things that you can apply at that point. The other path that you can take is to rely on if you have a regular freight forwarder, which a lot of us may, then you can use their expertise because they have this familiarity. They know a lot of the industry issues already. And most times they're going to get pretty darn close. There could be some times when they may or may not know, but I would guess that probably better than 95% of the time, they're going to be able to point you in the right direction.
That's a good feedback. Yeah. So, what are some of the things companies often overlook that or don't even realize when it comes to properly classifying their goods?
There can be a few different scenarios to look at regarding how you bring product in. And this is very important to understand early on. If you import a product as a complete product, that's going to have a different rate than if you bring it in as sub-assemblies, and even yet a different rate if you bring it in as piece parts. So those things can make a big difference. How you bring something in at a component level could cause it to end up in a different classification than what you intended. That's another challenge that you have to look at. Part of this could also have an impact, for example, on steel and aluminum is a big thing right now. Coming up in the future, we're going to be hearing more about the pharmaceuticals, right? So that's part of the scenario. You could have a simple classification for like a boiler, and it's an industrial part, which is different than if it is a water heater for, say, a fuel-powered engine, for example, or a water heater for a home installation, for example. So there's 3 different classifications, all to do with heating water, but different classifications for different commercial application.
All right.
Those are
So-
things that are going to be very important to pin down early in your research process.
Right. So, what type of person can really help with this kind? If you're, like your customer who had to kind of reassess things, what did they need to look for to be able to get that research done? properly right the first time?
So there are a couple of resources, and the one I would say start with is actually the government's HTS site. It's called hts.usitc.gov, and
Say that again. HC.
HTS Harry Tom Sam,
Okay, great.
and then it's usitc.gov.
Okay.
And it has a pretty good mapping of classifications if you know where to start, but you have to really spend some time looking at alternatives. Because, as I said, the water heater example, if you get the wrong one, you could be paying a much higher tariff rate than you maybe need to. So you can do a keyword search in there, or if you have a key code, then you can start to drill into the coding right away. So this is a really good place to begin. It does show you the primary code, and then there's a secondary and a segment code. And this is where you start to drill down on here's the product, main product, and then there's going to be, is it supplementary parts, is it subassemblies, is it service parts, is it raw material? It's going to break it all down into several different subcategories.
Okay.
Along with that, you also see in here which trade grouping. So if the standard tariff is group 1, so whatever's going to be the normal tariff situation, unless there's special circumstances, like North Korea, for example, that's going to be in the secondary group code under special requirements, and that could have a whole different group rate all of its own. Along with that, there are several countries that are often listed as part of a special trade agreement that's already established. And so those countries will be listed out right there as well. So if you're doing a standard import, that's going to be group 1. If you're doing non-standard, it's going to be group 2. And then you have to look for all the different possible listings that could be involved. So it is fairly extensive.
Sounds like it. And so one of the things that I always like to ask, we know that some of the best lessons come from when things go wrong, right?
Yeah, experience is a good teacher.
It is a very good teacher. So can you share an example of classification issues that went off the rails and what could have been done differently?
Yeah, I can give you a couple.
Okay, that'd be great.
One was a situation where a product was being sourced in China, and with the product was a whole kit of parts that would basically be accessories. So when it was received in country, you'd get the main product, then you'd get another box of all the other piece parts that have to be assembled onto the main part. But when you bring that in country, it was imported as if it's all one product under one code. The problem with that is that not everything in the piece parts would be identified that way. So if your inventory needs to receive each of those piece parts things individually, you've got a problem, right? Because what's going to be on the purchase order, what's going to be on the commercial invoice is this thing called a part with a bag of, a kit with a bag of parts, right? Which makes it really hard to do transactions against, because when you receive it in against the purchase order, you probably have to receive in all the piece parts to get them identified in your inventory. So this is one of the challenges that you can run into. If your commercial invoice doesn't match what the customs bill of lading is looking at and doesn't match the PO, then you can have some problems there. So this is something to be careful.
Yeah, what kind of problem might happen? Well, one I can see, our internal controls are difficult to manage.
Yeah.
Any problems?
Well, if you import it at the favorable rate of the kit, then you're receiving one part number, which is the item and the kit that comes with it. So it might be 2 boxes, but it's one part, right?
Okay.
And then you're paying X amount of tariff rate on that one part. But then when you go to receive it, you're receiving a multitude of part numbers in this box of parts. And you don't have a way to match your PO to what came through customs that way. Your PO and customs has to match. So what you receive, that's what I should say, your receiving transactions are now not going to match what you're going to put in your inventory. So you have to have a methodology to break it out to generate all these receiving items into your stock.
Okay.
I've seen people try to shortcut that circuit, and it created a massive paperwork nightmare by trying to go around that process.
And so you may end up having more costs than had you paid the tariff, right?
Well, yeah, you've got lack of traceability, you've got no part numbers, no receipt history, you've got no individual standard cost in your ERP system because it wasn't from a PO, it was a basically like a cycle count adjustment almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a way that you can have all kinds of problems just based on how you classified not being what you actually imported, not being what you're going to put into inventory.
Okay. So what could they have done differently?
Well, the short answer is if they match the shipper's items and the commercial invoice and your PO to what you need to receive, that's cleaner from transaction standpoint, but it very likely is going to be a higher tariff rate. So there's the problem, right? You're going to pay more on the tariff.
Right.
So you have to make some decisions. How are you going to live with the workaround there or pay more?
Gotcha. Because the workaround might be a wash,
Yeah, it could be.
Based on increased labor.
And if you ever had to send something back to that supplier, then you don't have any way to do it on a transactional level because there's no part number at the component level that was received, right? So this is where things get really messy.
Gotcha. Sounds like it. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience to help them get a full picture of what they're up against and what they need to do?
I would say there's two things to watch for. Number one is when you look at the US, the HTS code for the United States, that is not going to be exactly the same for all the other countries that you might be importing from. Okay, so there are about 200 countries that are in compliance the same way as the U.S. list is, but there are different subcodes, so you have to really be careful about how you line those up so that when you're doing your import from a foreign supplier that you've got the right ones. They have to be exactly right how it comes through to the US code, which might be different from a shipper's coding, okay?
Okay.
That's one thing to watch for. The other thing to watch for is and I've seen this happen where the commercial invoice, for whatever reason, ended up with a wrong code on a particular shipment, which is not normal. It was fine for several shipments and then something changed. And that created a much different tariff charge. And if you don't catch that coming through on your commercial invoice, then you're going to have a lot of things to backtrack and then do cleanup later. So it's very important to match up the shipper and the commercial invoice and the freight forwarder documentation and your PO, which is a lot of paperwork matching, but that's the only way you can avoid, we could easily spend tens of thousands of dollars on a wrong classification because of just someone made a typographical mistake.
Wow. So this is serious business.
Yeah, it is serious, and no one's going to pay attention except you. The customs might find a problem, but if somebody classified it wrong and they didn't see it, you're going to be paying the bill no matter what's on the previous or after.
Right. And they may not be very forgiving to let you change it.
You have to catch it before it goes through customs.
Right. So, well, Bob, thanks so much for your time today. Your insights have been really helpful, and I know our audience will get a lot from your insights. So I value this conversation quite a bit. And
Well, like you said, experience is a good teacher, and this is one of those I hope people don't have to have the full measure of that one, because that's a painful experience.
yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. Well, Bob, have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you next time.
Glad to help out.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.